So you've got need in the organism. And the organism doesn't think, oh, I need salt. We do, we can do that. But most animals aren't around saying, boy, I got to get some salt. The question is, what do you do when values conflict? Dewey's flushing all of that. What he's saying is, he has this very broad sense. He says by a morals come into play whenever considerations of better or worse are present. Right. In his body, in his face, in his movements and gestures, he's enacting meaning, but there's nothing linguistic about it. You're having the same look that most people do when I try to explain this.
No,
it's whoa. The problem is not where do our values come from? Like many philosophers have written over the years, we got to explain where our values come from. Do they come from feelings? Do they come from pure practical reason? Do they come from God? You know, and my answer to that is.
Today's guest is Mark Johnson, a professor of philosophy, and we'll be talking about his book Mind and Nature that he wrote together with Jay Schulkin, who sadly passed away just, I believe, 3 months ago. Yeah, and we will be talking about John Dewey, naturalistic philosophy, values, meaning, all the good stuff. And actually, you might know Mark Johnson from another famous book called Metaphors We Live By, together with George Lakoff, and Leben in Metaphern in German. So yeah, I hope you enjoy, and let's go. Okay, Mark Johnson, welcome to the Painting Audience podcast. Thanks so much for taking your time.
Nice to be here.
Okay, so the podcast is about your book, Mind in Nature, together with Jay Schulkin, who, sadly passed away just a couple of months ago.
Yes.
And I would like to start by asking how you two got the idea to write the book, and also how the writing process looked like, because I imagine it's being quite difficult, writing a book together.
Yes. I've had a lot of experience with that, but there are a lot of potential difficulties. Anyway, Jay, it was just a wonderful person, and he started calling me maybe 10 or 12 years ago, saying, I'm working on this stuff in neuroscience and biology of homeostasis and all this stuff, and a lot of it connects with what you're doing. And Jay was almost got a PhD in philosophy back in the 1970s, late 70s, but he decided to go over to neuroscience. So he's this guy who had this deep philosophical background and then all of the neuroscience, and he and I hit it off. And so mostly at his urging, we would talk for a while, once or twice a month, for a while. And then we decided we wanted to write something together. So we wrote this little piece called The Common Currency of Aesthetic Sensibility. We were both taken by the central role of the aesthetic dimensions in human meaning making and thought and reason and action and values. So we wrote this piece for a journal, and then I said, well, so Jay, what are you doing now? And Jay is a guy, he's published like 43 books. 43 books.
Yeah, not articles, books.
And over 500 articles. Okay. So he's very productive. And like while we were working on that article, he's working on 2 other books at the same time. And I said, well, so Jay, what are you doing and next, And he said, well, I want to write this book on Dewey's experience in nature. It's a really profound book, and I want to kind of just go through and see what he's doing and how it fits with contemporary cognitive science and contemporary philosophy. And I said, Jay, that's my favorite book, Dewey's Experience in Nature. Do you mind if I tag along with you? And he said, sure. And so this was right as COVID came on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was wonderful because every week, every Wednesday morning, we would talk. And what we did was we started in and we just like our first time we said, let's see how far we get in chapter 1. And we talked it out, what's his argument? What do we like? What don't we like? What did people think about it? And we just had a lovely time. I've never had so much fun on a project, I have to say. And so what happened was we only got through the first chapter, and already I started having ideas like, oh, I got to get this down and let's write. So I would write something, and then he'd look at it, and he was very quick at getting back and making revisions and all. And he would say, now I'd say, Jay, we need to add something on the neuroscience of homeostasis here, because that's a big deal in Dewey's thought. And he doesn't use the term necessarily, but and that's how it went, and a couple of times there were 10 chapters. He would start a chapter and I would come in, and we just would go back and forth. And really, I've co-authored with various people, and sometimes, you get into kind of disagreements that are a little uncomfortable. Jay and I never really had that issue, and he's a guy who I could get sort of grouchy and say, oh, that view, that's just, that's a mess or something. He'd say, well, let's figure out what motivated them. They must have been onto something. He always open-minded like that. So, and that's how we just crafted something. And it went very quickly, over the period of a year, we had it, nailed down. So that was a very pleasant, positive experience. And at the time he died, he said, he loved Peirce and he wanted to do a volume, something on Peirce. And I'd had Peirce in graduate school a long time ago. And I just thought, I don't know if I want to go there. And but unfortunately, we didn't have time to, to consider that. Yeah. So anyway, now the first I just mentioned I had another terrific, wonderful experience with writing, and that's with George Lakoff. And I met Lakoff in 1979 when I was a visiting professor out at Berkeley, and we hit it off and wrote together. And that was back before computers. So we had a Smith Corona electric typewriter. And I just want to say, in that one, we would talk out what we were going to write about and make some notes. And then he'd start typing, and I'd sit next to him at the typewriter, and I'd say, how about this? And he'd type that in, and then we'd work on it. And so that was another kind of experience I had. But there were a few times when we disagreed about things, and my view was, well, look, George is the famous linguist, and we're doing this work on metaphor, so I'm going to make my argument as best I can, and then if he doesn't agree, I'll go with what he says, because they weren't big, deep disagreements. And I know a lot of times people have ego things. And Jay was just great at letting your ego go. Don't take it so personally, and let's just look this through. And so I had a truly lovely experience with working with him.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And so it sounds like if there were disagreements, it wasn't really disagreements between you two, but rather you, for example, would say, well, I'm not sure or this is a mess what they're writing, and he would be more like a
and it was we could pretty much work things out just by a series of going back and revising. We talk about, he'd say, I don't think this is quite right. And so then you'd go and you try to get it, and then we'd see. And in this day and age, you can go back and forth with chapters quickly, and so pretty painless for us. It was actually kind of a joyful experience, and that's what we said in the very beginning of the book. We never, this was just fun.
It
was meaningful fun for us.
Yeah, great. And it's a good product. It's not, I mean, if you say it's fun, it's still, at least as I can tell, rigorous, and you draw heavily on science and
Yeah.
all that. So
Yeah.
yeah. So could you
We'll
maybe
talk
tell a
about
little
that.
bit? Sorry.
Yeah, I said we'll talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you maybe give a little overview about the book?
Yeah.
So I again say it's Mind in Nature, John Dewey, Cognitive Science, and a Naturalistic Philosophy for Living.
So we made three big claims, and a little bit tongue in cheek, but mostly very seriously. So here's the first claim. Dewey's experience in nature is one of the greatest books of the 20th century. And actually, Jay and I believe that it's one of the greatest philosophy books of all time. So we were being modest.
Yeah.
But I pointed out that, and I can say why I think it's, great, but,
Yeah.
we said, oh, you might think we're delusional, because we really, in mainstream philosophy, who pays attention to Dewey? Well, more and more people are paying attention to Dewey now, but we felt like we wanted to try to make the case. So that led to our second claim, which was that contemporary cognitive science and neuroscience very nicely enriches and supports and expands the scope of what Dewey was doing. In other words, we really believe that Dewey, for the most part, got a lot of things right, important issues. And we wanted to try to bring the cognitive and neuroscience evidence to bear to support it and flesh it out, and help people understand what it could really mean for us in the 21st century. And that's where Jay's work in psychology and in neuroscience played a huge role for us. And that part of the book, then we wanted to take on all of these. Here's the challenge. The challenge is to provide a naturalistic philosophy, one that doesn't call in transcendent forces or entities or acts or anything like that. That the claim was human beings are animals interacting with their environments. So everything that matters has to come out of the patterns of interaction with our environments. And our environments are not just physical environments, material environments. They're also interpersonal environments, like there is between you and me right now. They're social, cultural environments too. So he had a very rich sense of that. And so the challenge is to explain all of these capacities of humans and achievements of humans without, in a completely naturalistic way, a kind of evolutionary account of how meaning is possible. So, so we had to build up that. We had to start with the notion of what experience is. And Dewey had argued that people have very thin views of experiences, like what happens to you. But it's much more than that. And so we had to flesh that out. Then we have to tell a story about how, out of your bodily interactions with your environment, starting in the womb, but basically from infancy, how do you build up meanings? And how does consciousness emerge for a species? And we had to explain that without just saying, and then a miracle happens and we're conscious or something like that. And then we had to explain how knowledge is possible. Where does knowledge come from if you have this completely naturalistic view? And then a lot of people say, well, that's all right for that, but really values, you can't, values just are normative. They come in and impose on you. And so then we had to argue that values, just like Dewey did, that values emerge out of these patterns of interaction. And they're not absolutes, but they can be very profound and binding, in certain ways. And so we tried to think that through. And on and on. So, and then that led up to, so what is consciousness? What is knowledge? We had a chapter on that I really liked on what is the self? What does it mean to be a self if you're an animal, a very sophisticated animal, but an animal nonetheless, and not a little god, to use Dewey's language, and so we had a chapter on kind of a non-transcendent, embodied. We use the old thing called 4E cognition, mind and thought and meaning are embodied, embedded in situations, enacted through our actions in the world with one another and with objects in the world, and extended, offloaded onto aspects of the environment. So we had to describe a self that emerged in that way. And then we talked about what is philosophy. So what is metaphysics and what is philosophy then, once it's completely naturalized? And finally, then, and this is the third point, we had 2 points, greatest book ever, greatest philosophy book ever. That was first. Dewey is mostly supported by, sometimes enriched, and in a couple of places maybe critiqued a little bit by developing cognitive science. And then our third claim was, and this naturalistic philosophy for living is rich. It gives us a philosophy for living, but it's a philosophy for living, as you might expect, for creatures like us who are intrinsically social, who have things that matter to them. And then how does meaning come out of that? And so we're not saying you have a transcendental purpose to be realized. You're saying, no, you're in the world now. What do you make of it? So that was the third, and that's the last chapter of the book.
Yeah. So you mentioned already many terms that we will come back to, like consciousness, meaning, values, the self, and a naturalistic philosophy. So I was wondering, and you actually also say it in the book. I studied some philosophy, and some professor once said that, or like that other people think that philosophy had been this or studied this much of a topic, and you, I think, talk about a piece of cake, basically, and it's got eaten up by modern science, like physics and all that. And then I was wondering, naturalistic philosophy does that mean that science is like a friend, and that you use that science in order to make better philosophy? Or is it actually like a thief who's like grabbing away or eating the cake?
Okay, good. Yes, both of those. I mean, but okay. But it starts out with, and what you said is right, the gobbling up of the cake. So, philosophy there was natural philosophy in Aristotle. And for 2,500 years, philosophy has been in crisis for a long time, because over, like that professor said, over the centuries, actually, things which were under the purview of philosophy started being taken over by some conception of science. Of course, there are different conceptions of what science is and how it operates in different periods of history, but in general, you can see that. And so some examples were in the 19th century, in even the 18th and 17th centuries, instead of talking about essences, everything has essences and essences generate, philosophy starts looking for causal connections. Science starts looking for causal connections among things and trying to get explanations in terms of what they called covering law models or universal, principles that govern nature, that sort of thing. But then when you get into the 19th century, you get a new field of psychology. And philosophy had been psychology, had talked about what is mind and what is motivation and what is action and all of that. And then all of a sudden, there's this new independent field of empirical psychology. So, and you can go on, there's more about that. But the point is, I like to say, it's kind of a crisis mode. And it came to a head pretty much in the early part of the 20th century. And, philosophers started to say, we got to get rid of, we got to get rid of metaphysics, and we're going to prove that we're scientific, So there's,
yeah.
but they wanted to, but they didn't want, they weren't just scientists, so they would say, well, philosophy is kind of like the ultimate big picture, underlying what the sciences show. And so it was a kind of super science or something like that. And so Dewey, I think, very importantly, he saw science, and you already alluded to this, as a kind of cooperative, mutual development process. And Patricia Churchland called this, she called this the coevolution of philosophy and science, particular kinds of science, okay? And the idea is, like you said, that it's not that science is the enemy, but science is not the be-all and the end-all either. But science is great because it has various methods, not just one method. It tries things out, experimentally when it can, and there are all sorts of assumptions built into that. But it gives us some reliable knowledge of important things. And so the idea is, so what can science bring to philosophy, and what can philosophy bring to science? And kind of the Deweyan line is, science brings empirical responsibility to philosophy. It says, so no longer, when I was in graduate school, we were still doing, analytic philosophy of action and mind and language, and, a lot of sitting around pontificating about how meaning works and things like that, but never really looking at the sciences. That's just that, empirical work, and that's psychology, and, we're doing truth and meaning and all those things that really matter. So the emergence of science, the appropriation of the best science, it's not that the science tells philosophy everything it's got to do, and because there's not one science, there are multiple sciences and multiple methods in play. And so the Deweyan line is, and this is the line that Thomas Kuhn had, what should you do in the absence of absolutes? You should look for converging evidence coming out of multiple scientific perspectives. Is that the ultimate truth? No, it's the best thing we've got right now, and we can't do better. It has to be good enough. So that's what science can bring, a huge amount of empirically responsible inquiry. But now, what does philosophy do? Well, science, I hope I'm not offending people, but, science, not a lot of people doing the science think sort of philosophically about it. The science is usually so difficult, and they're so enmeshed in it, and that's understandable. But philosophy can bring a kind of critical perspective on the limitations of various methods. So, and I think that's a huge part. Philosophy can do a couple of things. It can say, look at the underlying assumptions of these sciences. Just keep those in mind, because they're structuring what that science is able to pick out as a relevant phenomenon, what it will count as a good explanation. And sometimes those scientists will pretend, well, that's the truth, or that, it's sort of like an absolute. And we have to be wary of that. And Dewey wrote a book called The Quest for Certainty, great book, where he shows how much philosophy has wanted to have certainty, and it wanted fixity. It wanted truths, that were foundational and couldn't be moved, and then we could build on them and all that. and Dewey says that's understandable because life is full of change and trouble, and we want to find a stable basis and all of that. But he says the best we can do is getting this converging evidence. And so science can critique certain assumptions and help us become aware of them, keep that in mind. But I'm sorry, philosophy can do that for the sciences. And philosophy can also look at what are the larger implications of various scientific works. Okay, what are the larger implications for who we are, for where meaning comes from, for what our values are, for how we can critique our values, those sorts of things. So I see these as, just as Churchill said, co-evolving, and Dewey saw it that way too. Okay, I think I'll stop with that. I can go on about that, but
Yeah,
it's kind of a it's a mutual working together that allows for critique, but is ultimately trying to produce a kind of reflectively insightful, empirically responsible account of nature. And of course, on a naturalist view, everything's nature. So
yeah.
there's no super nature to be explained or understood.
Yeah. Maybe just one question, because it just popped into my mind before we really delve into the book. I heard Thomas Metzinger, which you probably know.
Yes.
He said in a podcast on YouTube that he thinks that the past decades, philosophers came to realize that it's a good idea to learn more and more about neuroscience and all of that. And now then he said, well, now philosophers realize they have to learn more and more mathematics, with things like computational neuroscience and the free energy principle, active inference, predictive processing, and these ideas that also you hint at in the book. Do you agree with that?
I do, but let me just say this: it's so hard to do that, and so we have to be humble about this. It's like, I agree with everything you report him as saying, but people spend their lives working on predictive coding models, and that's just one part, and there's all the stuff about neural networks and that's changing all the time. And like, who can master all of this? There are just a very few people. You can't all master it. So, and that's one reason I've written 2 books and I'm on a third. And I could say, yeah, and another 2 books with cognitive scientists and neuroscientists, because I can't do it. It's just too hard. So we spend a lot of time them explaining to me and looking, at what the evidence is and all of that. And so now, depending on what you're interested in, you may be more like, oh, you got to learn what predictive coding is with Friston and others, okay. That depends on, what your project is. So you can be a little bit selective, but I think it's thrown open pluralism. Instead of the one method, there are multiple methods, and boy, are they all, they're each a challenge. And so I just say that with a measure of humility, here's why I put it to my graduate students. I mean, you just have to be ready to have someone say, well, that was stupid. That's not right. Okay, can you explain it to me? You can only do what you can do. And sometimes you're going to probably make a fool of yourself. But I'd rather do that, trying to figure this stuff out, trying to see connections, than stay locked up in, I've got an analytic method that I can bring to bear on such and such.
Yeah, and I think that you write those books with, as you say, Jay Schulkin, with the background in neuroscience and all that. I think that's one way to go, to do this interdisciplinary work.
Do that together, and so I think there are only a very few people in the world who can manage across all these different developments in so many different sciences, and then who have the philosophical background. It goes both ways. It's hard to find neuroscientists who care at all about philosophy, and it's hard to find. It's a little easier to find philosophers who care about neuroscience and other sciences. That's getting a little better now. But people who can really move intelligently among those different methods and all, that is awesome. And I think I guess one of my favorite people is Antonio and Hano Damasio, and Gerald Edelman when he was alive. I thought these were people who understand so much the science they're doing, but they see the philosophical implications, and they think like philosophers think on certain issues. And so it's a pretty small group, but I hope it'll expand, because it's like, if you start saying things about how language works and you don't have a neural account, you're pretty much hanging yourself out there, and so to get criticized, and so I think that whether that those who are willing to take the risk and go look at what's going on in the sciences and try to have a kind of layperson, almost an advanced layperson's knowledge of it, and then in some areas a little stronger knowledge than that, that I think that's, maybe I'm fooling myself, but I think that's the way things are going to go. That people, you can't just ignore this amazing stuff that's happening. But that doesn't mean you can't be critical of certain things too. I'm learning. I mentioned predictive coding, and Don Tucker is teaching me something about that. But it's a lot of this stuff is still speculative, and the evidence isn't completely in, and so we shouldn't be pretending that it is.
Yeah, and then there's also the danger, of course, with those theories, that everybody like jumps on it and nobody else is thinking about the other things anymore.
Yeah,
other
no.
levels of
Well,
analysis.
Talk about jumping on it. Here's a good example. Mirror neurons. When mirror neurons were discovered in monkeys and then extrapolated about that to humans, it's like everyone's getting all excited, and maybe legitimately so. But then people, who really didn't look very carefully at it, just start making these claims, and it's kind of it's a disservice to the good research that goes on, so like people get on board and they don't have much of a critical dimension to what they're doing. But I think this process levels itself out. People start to provide critical perspectives soon enough. I'm not saying that science is the only self-corrective endeavor, but it aspires to be a self-correcting endeavor. And everybody has to pick and choose what they're gonna draw on. And this is funny. One of my colleagues, I've forgotten what the context was. We were sort of like, I think we were in a seminar and he was sitting in or something, and he said, well, you're engaged in confirmation bias. I said, well, of course I am. It's like, why wouldn't I look for evidence that supported my theory? I mean, that's a good place to start. Let's get some evidence that supports our theory. I knew his point was, hey, but we need to also look for things that are contesting these these alleged truths.
Yeah, and I think, all this work with predictive processing, active inference, predictive coding,
Yeah.
the confirmation bias is very center stage in that. And I think
Oh,
science actually, like this whole method of science, at least brings a little bit more of those the objectivity into the game, because
oh,
we as
yeah.
persons also have all those confirmation biases,
Yes.
and this collective process of science, each checking each other if it's
Yeah.
really confirming evidence. Yeah,
Yeah.
but maybe we delve into the book.
Yeah.
I would like to start by talking a little bit about the term of the mind, and I would like to quote you. You say in the book, those who want to reserve the term mind only for conscious events and processes within an individual are free to do so. However, they are likely to overlook most of what goes into human meaning and thought. Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I personally have also thought about mind so far like that.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a big topic,
Hmm.
but so yeah, here's the first thing to say. Jay and I were trying to work out Dewey's theory of mind. And Dewey was influenced both by Hegel and so there was a kind of idealism there almost. But there was also a historical progressive dimension to that. And then he was influenced by the empirical psychology of his day and the empirical science. So I think and this is a grand generalization, and there will be exceptions and all, but so much, this has been pointed out by all kinds of people. There's been a prejudice in favor of a kind of individualism, an individualistic sense of the self. And it's like, so I drew a picture in a diagram in the book, that has like triangles representing 3 different people. And in the traditional view, there's a little part of the triangle filled in, and that's mind. So each individual person has a mind, and mind is the seed of all mental activity. That's kind of a common sense view. Dewey, and this is important, so let me step back. The approach we're taking is one that Dewey took, and that is we start with evolutionary accounts, and we say that the brain and body get wired up into rough general functional regions of the brain through a long process of evolutionary history. But that's not enough. Then that's the general species development, and you inherit, no 2 brains are alike, but you inherit functional areas of the brain that were the result of evolution. Then each individual has a personal history of experience that tunes up, you might say, the areas were connected, but now connections are made and strengthened between various areas of the brain. And that's a developmental sort of thing. And so we are the product of this evolutionary process. And then each individual develops. So there is something like, it's not saying there is a way it feels to be alive in my body right now. I'm not in your body and that sort of thing. But Dewey was trying to explain without any big gaps. This is what he calls the continuity principle. This is what a naturalistic philosophy has to do, I believe, Jay and I believe, that you have to explain new functional levels as emergent. And the idea is that as the complexity of the organism and the complexity of the environment, and the more complex the organism is, the more complex the environment is for it, because there's more things it can pick up on, affordances. So the idea is that the more complex that the organism environment is, that then new emergent functions occur. And the whole challenge for this philosophy is to explain how that happens without saying, and then it drops down from above, or it's a miracle happens and we don't know what to say about it, you know. So you have to tell a kind of gradualist story.
And how would consciousness, for example, fit in there? Because I think you're saying
Yeah.
that it's also like a graded concept,
It is great.
basically.
That's
Mhm.
exactly what we're saying. And Don Tucker and I and Fan Liu wrote a piece on this for the Journal of Neurophysiology on just that. But then let me talk about mind a little bit more
Yeah,
and
so, yeah.
consciousness. And Dewey didn't have all this neuroscience, but he gave the following account. So he wanted to say, mind is a level of possible meanings that occurs when we reach the level of social interactions with other people, communication, language. And he had a very rich sense of language. I'm not going to confuse things more, but he didn't think that language was just words. There could be kind of non-linguistic meaning too. He'll say more about that later. That's pretty important. So the idea is that culture is the repository of meaning, and meaning is always changing. Things are changing, and terms are not absolutely fixed. They may be relatively stable, but you can tell a good story about how meanings emerge and change. So Dewey thinks that that mind is more like a social reality of shared meanings and values, and that each individual grows up in cultures where they kind of imprint on, they engage mind. And so part of what they are is they're intrinsically social. They're not just a radical individual who happens to choose to be socially related. No, we are by our very nature interpersonal and related to one another and engaged with one another. And the very possibilities for a lot of meaning, it comes out of our embodiment, but it also comes out of the fact that, we have cultural processes that sediment these things. And so for Dewey, mind was not just in individuals, it was a shared thing. And then each individual engages the meaning possibilities of its culture and its situation. All right. So that's a little unusual notion of mind, but Jay and I argued that it was basically correct. We might want to tweak a little bit about that, but I won't go into the details. Now, so Dewey has a chapter on mind and consciousness. And so consciousness for Dewey is the way an individual person, it's a kind of a moment of action, of interaction, an individual person engaging mind and the world. And so let me say, it has to be like you pointed out, it has to be a gradualist sort of account. And Don Tucker and I are writing this book on deep feelings now, and we're trying to say about consciousness, consciousness operates implicitly. So it's not that we're either unconscious or fully conscious. There's a gradation.
So even within us,
and so there's kind of things we're kind of marginally aware of. I'm focused on you and your face, but now there's a horizon, Merleau-Ponty said, a horizon of possibilities for engaging the world, and they're kind of marginally or liminally out there. We're not right there focally aware of them. So Dewey created the following distinction that I like. He said there's focus, there's not a frame, that wasn't his word. But anyway, I'll say focus, frame, I'm forgetting the word, and field.
Fringe.
Fringe, yeah, that's it. Thank you. So there's focal attention, and we've taken that kind of as a model of what consciousness is supposed to be, but we're saying no, it's more than that. So there's focus, but the focus is always within a fringe of meanings that, maybe were operative just before now. They're sort of working under the surface now, and they might in the future become more explicitly, consciously entertained. So you get immediate focus, you get a fringe, and then you get a field of other related meanings, but they're sort of distant, and they're not right now really fringe. They're not kind of actively working. They're kind of out there on the margins, but they can become more important given your experience or your interests and directions. Okay. So he tried to explain consciousness in this emergentist way. This is one area where we don't think that anyone has a fully adequate theory of consciousness, and Dewey didn't, but we thought his was better than most. But I'll tell you, the one I'm most impressed with, and when we wrote this into the book, Damasio's account of what he calls proto-self, core self, and extended self, and he has kind of levels of the emergent consciousness in these. So there's a moment of consciousness, which he called core consciousness, and then there's a more extended consciousness that is kind of narrative in character. So we're still working. We're not pretending that we
you got
we've got that taken care of. But we don't believe. Let me just say, we don't believe with what we call. I think Owen Flanagan first used the term the Mysterians. We're not buying. Consciousness is a natural phenomenon. And the fact that we don't, fully have this nailed down doesn't mean that it's somehow of a completely different kind than, our other natural experiences. So there's ongoing work to be done there. I'll just.
Yeah.
That.
So
yeah.
With that, you mean, so you would maybe not say there's this hard problem, but just a very hard, easy problem with of consciousness. Or is it, are you saying, no, there is this hard problem, which is that like the subjective feeling of consciousness, for example, is just very, very different? Or do you say it's like an easy problem, but very difficult to solve, if you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, the easy problem was supposed to be how, biological being could, neurally generate consciousness. We're making a lot of progress on that. Okay. The hard problem, was supposed to be how any of that could ever explain the quality of feeling of something, And Jay and I think that latter problem is hyped way out of proportion. Because and that you're doomed to fail, because from the beginning they're just assuming that the felt quality, the qual, or the felt quality of something couldn't be captured in some way, and we're saying no, first of all, it's not an either or, all or nothing sort of thing, but we're saying to have that quality, to experience that quality, to have that feeling is just to be in, a certain range of neural states. And so we're not explaining what they wanted. We're saying what they wanted us to give them, by its very nature, they're right. It couldn't be solved. It couldn't be given on their terms. So
I see.
But this can get down into the details.
Yeah,
and I'd like to avoid that.
yeah.
But let me go back and just say, so in the developing, notice in the developing process of humans, we start with this ability to make just sensitive discriminations, like in environment. We go toward sugar or mother or whatever. We discriminate at a very basic level. but very quickly that has feeling associated with it. And Damasio, I like his idea that emotions are feelings of changes in our body state as it's responding to its environment, changes in its environment. So it's like, what he called it, the feeling of what happens, you know, and sort of phenomenologically, that's what it is. And then you have to tell a story that builds up to the highest levels of narrative consciousness that involve memory and all of that sort of thing. But for Dewey, all of that gets, it's that consciousness is the moment, it's the feeling of changes in mind, if you want to put it that way. But mind is connected with body. So you're feeling changes in your body state in connection with engagement with aspects of your environment.
Yeah.
That's not satisfactory, but that's the general, you know, more has to be filled in on that.
Yeah. One central term is also values, and I think you could probably connect it to feeling and all that, and also this continuity hypothesis. So what are values in this framework? And if you want, you could also already go to the need search satisfaction process, because I think they relate together. Together.
Oh, good. Let me start with the need search satisfaction. This was Dewey's idea. It's sort of in Peirce and James, but Dewey was most explicit about this. And this is really important because if you're a naturalist, you're going to say, look, biological processes, you know, certain biological processes underlie what we call higher level of cognitive activity. Well, so if you start with an organism and its environment, you then get the following. Dewey called it need search satisfaction. An organism is in relative, let's say it's in relative equilibrium or balance, what we call homeostasis. It's got the right amount of blood sugar and salt and stuff like that so that it functions okay. But let's say it doesn't get enough salt. Then it's the homeostasis that keeps us alive and flourishing is at risk. So you've got need in the organism. And the organism doesn't think, oh, I need salt. We do, we can do that. But most animals aren't around saying, boy, I got to get some salt. But they're already in need. Need is this preferential directedness towards some aspect of your environment. And that's what values are. They're just, they're habits of preference for certain things. So the organism needs, you can say, not consciously, but even at that basic level, it needs salt. It engages in search activity. This is a big thing for pragmatists because pragmatism is about action. It's not about sitting around thinking, you know. It's about acting in the world to change conditions for the better. So the organism has to act in the world and on the world and not just passively receive it, it engages it. And then it tries to bring about conditions. So getting salt in this case. And when that happens, then a certain kind of homeostasis is retained, brought back again, maybe not in exactly the same way, but, so that the organism can function, and we call that satisfaction. Okay, now that model, need, search, satisfaction, is fundamental for all animals, and when it gets to the human level, it just gets articulated much more deeply and profoundly. So now human beings can have a need, but they're not just automatically driven towards something. Sometimes they are, but they can then consider what the need is, and they can plan activities to try to satisfy the need. And when they get satisfaction, there's a kind of felt return to a homeostasis. But humans can do something, and many animals even better. They can do what is called allostasis. They can anticipate changing conditions and kind of address them before they get to be a problem. And that's a pretty amazing thing for human well-being. So and then think about this. What is knowledge? Well, Dewey said, knowledge is built on the need, search, satisfaction process. And when do you have knowledge? Well, when there was a need, so something's disrupted, something's uncertain. You're not sure what's going on now. Well, then you search, you investigate. And when you find a way to transform the situation, to overcome the indeterminacy, to remove the indeterminacy that had held you up, then there's a kind of satisfaction for now. But then, like Dewey says, things change, and then you're off and going again. But the point is, need, search, satisfaction operates at the most basic biological level, but it operates at a very high level for humans of abstract conceptualization and reasoning. And Dewey said, look, folks, scientific method, if there's not one method, but is need, search, satisfaction just at a very high level, a very sophisticated level. So he's got continuity between organisms adjusting to environments, to ordinary folks adjusting to environments, to sciences who have techniques, technologies, and a little more precision, in testability and all of that than most of us, but it's just an extension of a basic need, search, satisfaction process. Now, let me go to values. So Dewey is an anti-dualist about everything. You tell me a dualism, he's against it because he thinks it gives the lie. It falsifies the richness of what we experience. And one of the big dualities that he was trying to overcome is fact-value dualism. And I can't tell you how many, people they'll say, well, with respect to the physical world and our bodies in the world, we got science and we have scientific models and we try to give explanations in terms of those models, and that's all fine and good, but values have to come in because they can't just because they constrain you. And Kant was probably the greatest expositor of this. You needed pure practical reason to be the judge for assessing the quality of an action you were contemplating. That's another story. But the idea was, there's some things like in the worst cases of this, the worst misunderstanding would say, oh, science just has this method, it doesn't have values. But Dewey's saying all inquiry has values. Everything's shot through with values. Why? Because we are organisms preferentially directed toward aspects of our environment. So we have values. Like you've got a value, breathing, that's a value. All right. Having enough salt, that's a value. So I argued in the book that there are 4 levels of this, and there's nothing precious about this. If you come up with another one, let me know. But there are biological values, like having blood with a certain oxygenation level and stuff. And we share that with so many animals, and we share it with other humans, and it's absolutely life determining. If you don't have those values, you're a goner. So your system has been wired up to try to maintain those values without conscious thought. Okay, so those are all values. Then the next level is what I call interpersonal values. That is, values that arise from our immediate interpersonal engagement. And the model for this is a mother or father, but a parent caring for an infant. I'm drawing on Colin Trevarthen, in a psychologist, and what's the other guy? can't think of his name, the interpersonal, Daniel Stern, the interpersonal world of the infant. And so the infant and the caregiver are in this intimate dance, that you could not survive if you hadn't been cared for. We know this from some sad situations. So we depend fundamentally, we have values that are built into us, and they can be realized in different degrees in different ways. So they're not all just uniform and all that, but things like you need protection from harm, you need to be fed, and you need to be cuddled. If you're not cuddled, it really messes you up later in life if you don't get the proper attachment. So those are interpersonal values. The third level is just a higher level of community where you get values like rights and duties, social values in a community that are necessary for what? Getting along in a community. And right now, the world and the United States are completely messed up in that way, we're at odds with the values about that. And then the last, I call it the last level of values is things that have to do with living a meaningful life, like having activities that matter to you, things like that. So here's my I had to go through that to make the following claim. The problem is not where do our values come from? Like many philosophers have written over the years, we got to explain where our values come from. Do they come from feelings? Do they come from pure practical reason? Do they come from God? And my answer to that is we have plenty of values because we are preferentially directed toward aspects of our environment. And that preferential directedness usually constitutes a certain kind of need, or at least a desire. And so, and we have jillions, I'm exaggerating, we have many good explanations for where those values come from. That's not a big problem. The question is, what do you do when values conflict? That's a real question. That's what we don't have, we can all say, if I don't have enough salt, I'm a goner. If I don't get enough water in a certain number of days, I'm a goner. And that's pretty hardcore stuff. But what most of morality and moral theory is about, but it's really in the moral psychology is seeing this. It's what do you do when your fundamental values, either values you have within yourself or values in relation to others, when they conflict? How do you resolve those? And that's another issue. But so that's what I'm meaning by values. And I'm saying, obviously, all experience is valenced. And Dewey had a distinction that I kind of like. He made the distinction between valuing and valuation. And so it's easy to explain. Valuing is just to say you have values. You're directed, you prefer one thing over another. All right. But valuation is being able to bring a critical perspective to the value. Well, you've got that value, but what does it mean? And does it maybe conflict with other people's value? So valuation is bringing a critical edge, to a reflective edge, to bear on on valuing. Valuing is just, he says, a psychological fact. People value things. But should they value those? Yeah, well, if it's things to keep you alive, yes, but at all costs, and you have so that there's not a list of what are the fundamental values, but you can make a pretty good list, of the levels. You can see, if you look at moral theories, how all the things you come up with have been talked about as values in some level, in different kinds of moral theory.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions here. So for one, so this valuation, is this kind of like a strategy to try to solve the value conflicts then? Because you deliberately think, okay, I have this value and I have this, how can I compromise
How can
or
I
prioritize?
harmonize them? Yeah.
Harmonize.
So it's like, here's what happens. When do you get a moral problem? And this is classic Dewey. Dewey says human beings are creatures of habit. And he actually takes this so far. And look, you can give a neuroscience account of habit, as functional clusters of neurons that have fired together and strengthened over time. They develop habits. Okay. So you develop habits of interacting with your environment and with your, with other people, and addressing cultural values and such. And they are habits. But here's the problem. Habits grow up in particular conditions. They're the result of certain conditions in the environment and the nature of the human being in engaging that environment. Well, those habits, and we learn to work on autopilot. Those habits are working. I have a way I sit, when I'm not thinking about it, and it's a bad habit. Okay, I'd like to change it, but because the posture is important.
Yep.
But anyway, so you have these habits. The problem becomes when new conditions emerge that the habits aren't adequate to, because the habits worked for you before, but now there are new conditions. I'm older, right? And your body naturally wants to pull forward and hunch over, gravity, and you need to fight that, actually, to have things in alignment and all of that. So habits aren't bad in themselves, but in certain contexts, they can become rigid and unresponsive to the details of the situation. So Dewey's claim is that's when you need what he called dramatic imaginative rehearsal. You need the capacity to imagine how different habits could play out, habits or values could play out in a situation. And it's just what you said. You said, so you've got these conflicting values, and it's an attempt to figure out, could they maybe be harmonized in some way so that they're not just, blocking me? Because when habits get blocked, we don't move forward. We're in stasis. And a lot of people, that's what a lot of us do. We would rather go, we encounter a new situation, like gender stuff, all the issues around gender and transformation and indeterminacy and all of that. And we say, no, we know what men and women are, for Christ's sake. Let's get serious about this. No, but those are just our habits, prior habits. They arose. And you can't even say, oh, it worked for the 1950s. I mean, there were already problems there. We know that now in retrospect. But okay, so new conditions emerge. And you need what, this is the whole problem. It's how can there be plasticity of habit? How can there be plasticity? And that's the problem for moral philosophy and moral psychology. How can you have a valuation, which is criticism of values, see their limitations and come up with new ones? Because notice, Dewey says a human being, or the self, is an interpenetration of habits. I think that's terrific. It's all the habits that have developed through your individual development in a culture. And so you have learned habits of thinking. I mean, we go through these long, elaborate things, how many years, you start to think, how many years have you been in education, formal education? Preschool through all in the lower levels to high school, or whatever it's called, gymnasium or whatever it's called, all the way up into, and all these years, and we're learning habits of how to read, of how to analyze things, of what matters, what are the important philosophical problems, blah, 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 what are the methods? And those are all sedimented habits for us. And if those become rigid, then they're not responsive to new conditions, and they cease to be effective, so we need to figure out a need search satisfaction process that is open to multiple values. Let's put it that way. And look, there's no easy answer. How do we resolve these? We wanted it. We wanted a rule or some ultimate algorithm that could tell us what's the right thing to do here. We never had that, I want to say, really. We may have told ourselves we did. God tells us what to do. And here's what God tells you. And then some people, God tells you one thing, and others say God tells you something else. And, but we may have thought we had these absolutes, but I want to say from a neuroscience and psychological perspective, we had habits that functioned in a certain way relative to a certain kind of context. But I don't know about you, but I don't want to go back to the habits of the medieval monastery, frankly. There's various habits, and we have these habits of war, and so the idea is that education should open up the capacity for critical reflection, could open us up to possible meanings rather than lock us down. But how that works is a big, difficult story to tell.
Yeah.
Did I address the question?
I'm
values,
what I want to add here is that I'm in training for becoming a CBT therapist, and I can't help but have my therapist hat on and see values also a lot, not just moral values, which can be also part of problems, for example, but also those just what you like, what your life goals are, and all of that, and goal conflicts or value conflicts are very central in therapy. And what you said about the habits, it also very fits very nicely, because patients often have habits that are very rigid and not flexible, and then we often ask people when they come into therapy, well, why are you coming now into therapy? And they often say, well, now something happened, something is different, and then all the problems that are clearer to see, and all of that. I just wanted to add that and ask you, is Dewey and also your whole framework putting the moral values at the center stage, or you're also talking about all those, because you also talked about meaning, and meaning, finding meaning of life is probably of course not just about moral values, so I guess you also,
good. That's a great question. But look, the thing we're trying to overcome here, and Dewey was trying to overcome, there's been this tendency to break experience up into kinds. So you have aesthetic experience, you have moral experience, you have, you say scientific thinking, you have economic experience, you have political experience. And then that tends to support a faculty psychology. And faculty psychology is still around. And you'd think in the 21st century, we'd have gotten over that. But the idea that we have these distinct faculties, and you explain how they work together to generate each type of experience. Dewey's flushing all of that. What he's saying is, he has this very broad sense. He says by morals come into play whenever considerations of better or worse are present. So you see, he's saying it. You can call these aesthetic values, you can call these moral values. Okay, you do, and we will do that. We'll say, issues surrounding respect for a human. I'm going to call that a moral value. But his point is that all of those dimensions, the aesthetic, the moral, the economic, the political, are interwoven together. And when you have such a broad notion of morality as, better and worse by what? By way of activity. So when you said, so we carry it over to the realm of meaning. and that's better or worse too. And so I don't worry about whether I call them, moral values. I mean, sometimes in some contexts I'll call them moral values, but I want to say morality's potentially everywhere in our experience. It's not, here's the view to get over, that there's a certain part of you, where, or a certain range of experience that is demarcated from every other kind of experience. Now, what there are instead are kind of prototypical things. There are prototypical examples of science. There are prototypical examples of physics, of psychology, and people in the fields can identify them. But they're just prototypes. They have radial category structure. There's central members, but there are also other members connected, but not sharing all the features, what Wittgenstein called family resemblance relations. So so living a meaningful life, in Dewey, I think, rightly says, if you want, that's where the kind of the rubber ultimately starts to meet the road. I mean, once we are not threatened with death immediately, I mean, but anyway, achieving meaningful engagement with the world is fundamental for us. And is it moral? Well, it's moral in the sense that it concerns better and worse by way of action in relation to oneself and other people and the world, I mean, so it's not just anthropocentric. I don't, anyway, so you get animal rights and you get ecological, rights and that sort of thing. So we need to unrigidify these characterizations of experience as being of one kind and not the other. And so one of the things Jay and I, this is the next to last chapter, no, the third from the last chapter in the book. It's the longest chapter in the book. It's on aesthetics.
Yeah, I wanted to ask.
Because it says aesthetics is not just about beauty and nature and the philosophy of art. Aesthetics is about how we make meaning. Okay. And so all of our values are aesthetic values at some level too, But notice, some of the values are so automatic because they need to be, to keep us alive. And others are much more, reflective and, so that's another story to be told. But I'm seeing an interweaving of aesthetic values with moral values, with political values, with issues of race, gender, on and on. And you can sort them out, you can separate them out in a certain context of discussion if that helps. I don't think for the most part that helps that much.
Yeah, I see. So yeah, let's maybe stick with the aesthetic sensibility, as you call it, and why maybe you could explain why it's you say the common currency of our meaning making. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So this was what Jay and I, we wrote this paper on the common currency, and then we incorporated the argument into this book. And I think over the last, so I teach philosophy of art when I was teaching. That was one of my courses, this philosophy of art and aesthetics. I started out teaching Kant's aesthetics. I was an expert in Kant's third critique. And I taught Kant's moral theory. Over the years, I quit doing that. Not so much the aesthetic part, but the ethical part. I started having I could explain it and justify parts of it, but I started having trouble, just putting it forward. So I backed away from that. But one of the things that I understood from the third critique of the critique of judgment was Kant at least appreciated the importance of imagination, almost, not quite enough, because he thought imagination was not like, it had kind of one foot in concepts or rules, formal stuff, but it had to have one foot in images and feelings in the world. But he couldn't quite get those together. He still had a kind of hidden underlying dualism, I think. And so I started, so after Lakoff and I wrote Metaphors We Live By, the next topic we turned to was embodiment of meaning. And so for the last 40 years almost, I've been doing work on the embodiment of meaning, the role of the body in the constitution of meaning. If meaning doesn't drop down from above, from like pure syntactic structure and all of that in a Chomskyan fashion, it has to work its way up. So how does that happen? And then I got the idea that, and Jay shared this idea, that things we were talking about with respect to art, and this was a Deweyan idea, are actually fundamental to meaning making. They're not unique just to art. But Dewey said art is a kind of consummatory enactment of possibilities for meaning. So it's like meaningful experience on steroids. That's what art is. All right. And so if you then you start seeing the things that are discussed in aesthetic theory, like what? The qualitative qualities. We haven't even mentioned that word here, but it's fundamental to what we're doing. And Dewey said that philosophers have not paid enough attention to the qualitative dimensions of experience and all the work they're doing. And there's a story to be told about that. So you look at, there are theories of aesthetics that look at form as absolute. There are theories that look at expression of emotions. There are theories that look at certain kinds of qualities. And there are theories that focus on mimesis or imitation. And you can catalog those theories in aesthetics, and I taught that stuff for years. But if you start thinking about those elements, they play a fundamental role in meaning. And now let me explain this. So here's a huge problem, but bear with me because it's like the one I think we haven't talked about enough here.
Please.
The problem is, so in this building up of ever more complex systems through evolution and individual development, where does meaning come in? And so many people, I was originally trained in philosophy of language, by the way, and speech act theory, which I still like. But I didn't like the mainstream philosophy of language. It was all about truth conditions and stuff like that, because it didn't seem that it adequately captured what was really going on with people, with their feelings, their emotions, and that sort of thing. And so anyway, Dewey says that in order to have that meaning, you need language. Now, I've spent the last 30 years of my life working on that, and I would deny that. I want to say there is linguistic meaning, but there's a vast subcontinent of or pre-linguistic meaning going on that the linguistic grows out of and depends
afterwards, probably.
Yes. So but then Dewey, so there are two ways you can go on this. You can say that there's pre-reflective meaning and pre-linguistic meaning, and then there's and you can call that meaning. And if you do that, you just have to have and you can call that language. You can say it depends on language, but then you have to have a much broader notion of language. And there's one place where Dewey says language can be painting, dance, working with machines, ritual practice, music. Okay. So over the last 30 years, I've written on all of those areas in architecture and theater to try to show how those are fundamental acts of meaning making. And I've gotten letters emails from people all over the world saying what we've needed is a way to talk about the meaning we know is operative in music or in dance, or in painting. But the models of meaning from philosophy and some from linguistics are not cutting it, because they don't get down into the qualitative dimensions and the emotional dimensions and all of that. So one way to do this, it's kind of Dewey's way. Say all meaning requires language for its articulation. You don't have genuine meaning until you get there, but he uses language in a very general way. Another way to do this, which is my way, is to say there's linguistic meaning. There's what happens when it takes up into systems of symbols, but there's a vast continent of other meaning, embodied meaning that is, involves music, dance, architecture, ritual practice, things like that. But you can go either way. It depends on your audience. And the point is, we have to pay attention to all of those things because they're fundamentally at work as the very possibilities for meaning for us. And I want to say that the arts are exemplary enactments of possibilities of meaning. So I've got a lecture I give, and the last slide is a video from Singing in the Rain, the musical. And Gene Kelly kisses Debbie Reynolds goodnight, and it's raining, and he's just happy as can be, and he does Singing in the Rain. And I end the lecture with that because in his body, in his face, in his movements and gestures, he's enacting meaning, but there's nothing linguistic about it, but it's meaning, it's profoundly meaningful, and it's delightful. And so I play this little clip out. And you can, and what you need to do is go to each of the arts. Like, I've done a couple of articles on architecture, and see that architecture is about affording certain kinds of meaningful spaces for animal interaction, or human, usually, interactions, right? Affordances. So underlying this whole massive project is an appreciation of the bodily basis of meaning in all things, and the recognition that that bodily basis is intimately tied up. You can call this within aesthetics of meaning. It's going to be an account of meaning that, yes, looks at structure, looks at syntax, but syntax is meaningful. Syntax is not just pure form, it's meaningful form. And it grows out of the structure of our embodied experience. And so that's what this may be unusual what I'm saying to people, but I'm trying to refocus. Jay and I were trying to refocus in that book, on the chapter on art, on meaning. We were trying to refocus on all of these dimensions that get ignored in philosophical treatments, which try to make everything into a conceptual structure or something like that, if it's meaningful. And then that other stuff, they don't want to use the word meaning because it's too messy. We can't formalize it or something like that. That may be a little bit unfair, but not too unfair. So if no one ever used the word aesthetic, I'd be satisfied if they were willing to appreciate that meaning is tied to our embodiment. And there are all these different ways meaning gets enacted, which are not in the first instance linguistic. If they would agree with that, Jay and I would be happy, and Dewey would be happy. And if they didn't want to call that aesthetics, well, okay. But I want to call it aesthetics because I taught aesthetics for all these years. And when you look at the different theories about the arts, you see these dimensions that we're now bringing together. There's form, quality, affect, what Stern calls affect contours, like buildup of tension and release in music. That has its roots in the bodily buildup of tension and release, like a baby reaching for a bottle, trying to, and the body is enacting that tension and then that release. And so we feel that when we hear music. We hear a Beethoven symphony, and the Romantics were great at this, or they overdid it. Build you up and then pull you down, build you up and pull you down. But we know that in our bodies. We know that feeling. And that's what Don Tucker and I now are trying to work on. We're doing a book called Deep Feelings. We're trying to say, at the very core of our being are positive and negative affect. And positive affect shows itself as elation, a kind of mild elation. It's that things are going all right. We call that the world is my oyster view. And then the other direction of negative feeling is anxiety. And you know how much a role that plays in your life. And anxiety colors your whole world when you're anxious. And if it's really bad, you fall into depression. Elation colors your world at a kind of positive valence. So that it's a value. But if you take it too far, you get elation and you get kind of like spinning off into, grandiosity. So each of those feeling bases are important, but they have their excesses, and those excesses show up as, clinical depression or mania, that kind of thing. So, as I said, I want to keep using the word aesthetics. And I'll tell you why, because maybe it's just a personal thing. Jay would laugh about this, but, when I was in graduate school, there was this prejudice that real philosophy did logic and epistemology and maybe some ontology. Okay, that was real. That was manly philosophy. And then what was left over? Values. Okay, and the value fields were ethics, social philosophy and political philosophy, and aesthetics. And notice aesthetics was always last. It was the one you didn't have to worry about. You had to have a political theory and a moral theory, but you didn't have to have an aesthetics. If you wanted to do that, okay. And so I'm saying, look, that's the thing that they threw out, they ignored. And I now want to say, you know what you threw out was absolutely essential to experience in the meaning of things for us. And that's what Dewey said. He said that in Experience in Nature, and he said it also in Art as Experience, another one of his books.
Yeah. There's so much to say here. I think you have to go soon, right?
Yeah, I've got about another 10 minutes.
Okay.
If I don't know where you are in the question list, but
I would just make a comment on meaning and have one last question, basically.
Okay.
With meaning, I still have difficulties understanding maybe the gist of it, because, for example, when we speak about meaning in language, I understand like there are sentences, syntax, and all of that, and I understand something. It means to me something. Then there are, I think, on YouTube in a lecture, I'm not sure, but I think you are talking about this bottle of water and how this could mean so many things. Drinking it, throwing it, whatever. And then you talked about this guy singing in the rain, and this is, to me, it seems also another kind of meaning. This really like this meaning of this whole situation and this happiness and all of that.
Yes.
Can you,
yes.
Do you understand
that's a great way to kind of bring this around to a close. First off, let me give you my definition of meaning, and then I'll go into that thing about the whole situation. So here's my pragmatist theory definition of meaning. The meaning of anything, event, state of affairs, is what it enacts by way of experience. That experience can be past experience, present experience, or future projected possibilities. So when you ask what the meaning of thing is, it's not a conceptual nugget, abstract nugget somewhere in your noggin, your head, your brain. I mean, there's activation of pathways, in the brain, but the meaning of something is what it affords you by way of experience. I'm using J.J. Gibson's notion of an affordance, that given an animal with a certain kind of body and brain and an environment with certain structures, energy structures and patterns, that environment will afford ways of interacting. And so meaning is about action and engagement, and it's about how experience plays out. So the meaning of something is what it enacts or brings forth in a context about experience, in experience. And like I said, part of the meaning of what's happened is what's happened, what has been prior is carried forward into the present moment. So it's kind of working there. And that carries into projection into future possibilities for meaning. Now, one place we didn't have Dewey to do this, but Jay and I brought this in. It's called simulation semantics. Ben Bergen is one of the people, and Larry Barcelow, the psychologist, now this simulation semantics is growing. And what it says is that, what's the meaning of a cup? Well, it's all of the affordances. It's the experiences it enacts. And so it's going to be an enactment or a simulation of various perspectives, visual you could have of a cup, right? But it's also going to enact experiences of lifting a cup, drinking from a cup, so there are going to be tactile experiences, there are going to be motor experiences that are relevant, and there's the present totality of those experiences is the meaning of a cup. And notice so that'll be there'll be a prototypical cups and there'll be non-prototypical cups, like an award cup or a soccer cup or stuff like that. And there's a whole range of things that are cups, but the central ones share features that look like an essence. That's not an essence, it's just the characteristics that make something central, because many of those characteristics happen over and over again. Okay, so meaning, let me say this again. The meaning of something is what it enacts or by way of experiences that are at once physical, interpersonal, and cultural. So it's a thing about action in the world and what things make possible, what actions are made possible. It's always moving forward because new situations arise that afford you new possibilities. So the meaning of cup is pretty stable now, but I started using cup as an example 30 years ago. I heard this from Margaret Winters and Jeffrey Nathan. I was sitting in on a linguistics class, and we were looking at radial category structure and prototype structure. And back then, the prototypical cup was sort of like a teacup. All right. But today, my students, none of them ever come with that as the main one, because they're used to Starbucks cups. That's the prototypical cup from them culturally. Now that other thing, a ceramic teacup or a mug or whatever, those are present in the category, but they're not the prototype anymore. So even something as basic as a cup, its centrality, its prototypicality has changed over the years. Now, this brings me to the last thing, maybe. You talked about the meaning of a whole situation. And this is something I've been fretting about for over 30 years now. And it's a claim Dewey made, and Jay and I tried to articulate that claim in our book. And it's this. Dewey says that everything starts from an organism interacting with environment. We've been through that multiple times. But what does an organism encounter? It encounters a situation. That was Dewey's term. And the situation is it's like what was called the Umwelt,
Mhm.
that term in what's his name? Von Uxküll. Yeah. Jakob von Uxküll created the notion of an Umwelt. So there's an environment, which is a bunch of things out there, energy patterns enacting. But as soon as an organism gets in the environment, it has an Umwelt, a kind of surround of lived meaning for it. Okay. And Dewey said, look, all experience starts with a situation that you're in. It has all these values going around in it, past experiences that have led up to it. There's a halos of meaning around it, fringes and fields of meaning and all of that. But he says, then what is an object? An object is something that stands out as an affordance within a background. But without the background, you lose all of the meaning of something. And so, but here's the problem with this. I think he's absolutely right about that. And he wanted to say that, like, how do you know that something's relevant to your to what you're thinking about now? I mean, so let me give you an example of this. You can have logic, which shows relations of A to B to C to D and all that, but it will it will depend on relevance, but it does not supply relevance in a sense. I mean, where does something become relevant in a situation? And Dewey said, you feel its relevance. And a lot of people aren't going to like this, what we're saying. But here's the phrase he coined. He coined the phrase, a pervasive qualitative unity of a situation is the starting point for any experience. Instead of having a bunch of objects that you have to put together in an experience, you have already a togetherness, and then you differentiate within that. That's so a cup becomes a cup in this, against this background. But the background, you can never describe it fully, because when you do so, you'll do it in terms of particular qualities. And what you're trying to describe is the overall pervasive unifying quality of the situation. Okay, now here's an example. You go into an art museum, you look down and you see a Matisse. What do you think is a Matisse? Now, you've never seen that artwork before. Now, the pervasive quality isn't its Matisse-ness, and that can be misleading. But there is something, you might recognize it as being a Matisse or someone who was follower of Matisse, you know. But the pervasive unifying quality is the quality of that particular work, not anything else, that particular work that makes it what it is. But you can't articulate that. If you start to articulate that in terms of particulars, those are all selections out of there. And so they won't capture the work that the unity of it's doing that determine what's pertinent for you. Now, and I think this is important for an account of meaning and values and all kinds of things. And Dewey did too. And so I've spent more time than maybe is proper trying in various places, and most recently in that book with Jay, you know, the one we're talking about, Mind and Nature, is trying to explain what the, you know, like pervasive quality, what that means. We can't say what it is. I mean, it's that thing which gives a situation a kind of differentiation and qualitative presence for you. But what's hard about it is if someone says, well, how am I going to do logic differently if I understand that? And it gets to become difficult to convince people that, you know, that what we're really doing is we're organisms in an environment encountering situations which afford possibilities for meaningfulness. And what they afford us depends on picking out certain things as relevant. And that's done relative to this background unity. Now, I guess that's all I can say now, given our time constraints. And in a way, I almost hate I leave people with it's a kind of thought-provoking idea, but I think one will need to work with more examples and, to kind of flesh out. I mean, I'm not surprised that they say, oh, well, that's kind of interesting, but I'm not going to go there. It's too vague, and, that's the trouble. But it's like notice I'm saying we can have knowledge of the world because we grew up in a world. We were never distanced from the world. And we were always in situations, and those situations always had feeling dimensions. They always had form. They always generated relevancy for us. And we can try to make them explicit with language. But that's more like pointing a person, it's like using language to try to kind of get them to experience the unifying quality of the situation. Yeah, so you're having the same look that most people do when I try to explain this.
No,
it's like, whoa, this is maybe, but
no,
I know the feeling.
I mean, we don't have time, so we could spend probably just a long time to talk about this. I just have an intuitive feeling that I think I grasp it, and it sounds very interesting. But then again, as we said, sure, I have many question marks. So
your fingers, and as soon as you try to describe it for a particular case, what you're doing is selecting out particular qualities and acting they capture the wholeness of it, and they don't. Okay.
With the relevancy of certain things, I guess this is still very connected to values, right? Because
yes, it is.
I mean, everything we kind of do, etc., has to be some value, otherwise we wouldn't go for it. But very interesting, and I will look forward to this new book, because I think this probably will come up in the book as well.
It does.
So I mean, we could, like I said, spend so much more time to talk about this, and even though it's not that big, I think there are so many big topics, and you go through all of them. It's very, very fascinating.
And let me just say, I mean, just as a personal thing, I want to, Jay's not here to thank, but I thank him for the opportunity to work on this. I just want to say that.
Yeah, I think that's a great,
wonderful experience, and I grew a lot in it. And we had a real ride there, a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to end this. So, Mark Johnson, thank you so much for taking your time.
My pleasure.